What's up YouTube, it's Phanta, and there's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot when talking about RPG video games. That phrase is, as wide as an ocean and as deep as a puddle, or more simply, a mile wide and an inch deep. I don't think I need to explain what this phrase means, but when we're talking about RPG video games, it means the game has a variety of systems, mechanics, and options for the player to mess with. But when you take a closer look, those options are simple and shallow, and they provide for a boring experience after a couple of hours. Let's take Skyrim for example. The game has well over 130 spells and 30 shouts to use, but most of them are either situational or completely useless. None of them are as useful as the ones you start with. And now you might be asking, what does any of this have to do with Phantasy Star? Well, from my experience, Phantasy Star actually has the opposite problem. The game's tutorial presents it as simplistic and easy, and does a terrible job explaining any of the complex mechanics at play. New players will quickly hit a wall, and they'll be confused on how to progress their character any further. But before we discuss any of that, let's discuss Phantasy Star as a whole. Phantasy Star began as a series of role-playing games that released from 1988 to 1995. There's been a lot of remakes and re-releases, but for the most part, this series ended in 1995 with Phantasy Star 4. Next up we got Phantasy Star Online. It released on the Dreamcast, GameCube, and PlayStation 2 in 2000. Now this game is extremely significant. It was one of the first MMOs on a home console ever, and this game was very successful. It spawned a number of spin-offs, sequels, and ports. After that was Phantasy Star Universe, essentially the same concept but for the 7th generation of consoles. And while Phantasy Star Universe was the least successful of any of the sub-series, it set the precedent for the next game to come. And that game is Phantasy Star Online 2, the subject of today's video. And despite the title of the game, it actually has nothing to do with the first Phantasy Star Online. They have no central characters or locations in common. Phantasy Star Online 2 began development in 2007, and they had the free-to-play model in mind from the beginning. The game released on PC for Japan in 2012, and would come to America and release for the PC and Xbox all throughout 2020. But enough about that, let's talk about the game. Phantasy Star Online 2 is an MMORPG in concept, but in reality it's more like a regular multiplayer game. There aren't a lot of massively multiplayer moments. You usually aren't in an area with more than 20 or 30 people at a time. The game is an action RPG featuring 9 distinct classes with different weapons, skills, and skill trees. And the diversity between these classes is nothing to sneeze at. Playing as a hunter, a gunner, and a summoner is like playing 3 different games. But this is where part of that unnecessary complexity comes in. You pick your class when you first make your character, but you can change your class at any time at the class counter. I think this is an awesome feature that all RPGs should have. It allows characters to experiment with new class setups without having to make a whole new character. But the thing that's really confusing is the subclass system. At level 20, you unlock the ability to use a subclass, and essentially, using a subclass allows you to use the skills and techniques of another class, but not their weapons. For example, if you choose Hunter as your main class and Summoner as your subclass, then it provides you no benefit whatsoever. Because you're a hunter, you can't use any pets. The game doesn't explain any of that though, and instead you're given a simple splash screen explaining a basic overview of the subclasses, and you're left to your own devices. Now some players may like being handed this mechanic and being told to explore its intricacies and figure it out by yourself, but for many other players, they'll overlook it because of how simple it seems, and they'll be much weaker as a result. This flaw extends to 2 other areas as well, the auxiliaries and crafting. Now Phantasy Star does a good job of introducing new players to a majority of the content through the ARX missions. The ARX missions are essentially a long series of tutorial quests that help introduce the player from content from level 1 to level 20. And while these missions do a pretty good job on introducing a variety of mechanics and giving the player a path to build on them, it does a terrible job for auxiliaries. Auxiliaries are companions that can come with you on quests, like pets, but every class can use them. They can also complete certain quests for you, specifically ones where you need to collect materials. The game does a pretty terrible job of explaining these features though, only leaving you with less answers and more confusion. That isn't the only major flaw this game has though. The second biggest one is its reliance on the cash shop. I talk about microtransactions pretty regularly on here, and I'm only going to be talking about them more. But honestly, in games like these, I don't have a problem with them if they're done properly. This game has so much content available for free. To put it in perspective, there are 17 different types of quests, and you can do the majority of them completely for free. There are no microtransactions gating how fast you level up. For the most part, that's up to you, but premium players have an obvious and ridiculous advantage over free players. Premium players can start a shop, they can trade with other players, and they can accept more missions. Premium players also have access to drinks that allow them to fish and mine more, as well as a large variety of cosmetic items that they can sell back to get more premium currency. But even with all this, and despite the title, Phantasy Star Online is not a bad game. Compared to other free-to-play games, it has amazing combat, incredible customizability, and you can do so much as a free player. The game is hovering around 11,000 concurrent players on Steam, and I hope it continues to grow. I want the community to see these issues and point them out to the staff. Once that happens, I'll have faith that this will be the best game that everybody's playing. And that's all I got today, so make sure to like and subscribe. Hope you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.